Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started on time. We have to finish on time because there is the voting. Kosumat is from the GUE, this hearing on anti-mafia rules. It's an initiative taken by the GUE group. It's not a terribly easy subject to convey to European institutions. It's often viewed as being a local issue related to local problems and overlooked for that reason. I'm going to be chairing the first panel discussion. The first speaker will be Giorgos Vassiliadis, who's the Secretary General of the anti-corruption fight in the Greek government. Then Francesco Forgione, who is the part of the Anti-Mafia Parliamentary Committee from 2006 to 2008, and he'll talk about the mechanisms to combat. And then Massimo Bongiovanni will speak, who will talk about mafia infiltration, which is an exemplary case of tremendous import, how the mafias are starting to affect major infrastructure works in Europe. And then Marco Travaglio, who's a very well-known journalist from the daily Il Fatto. He's going to be telling us about the Milano Expo. My job is merely to chair and introduce the speakers, reminding you that we're on European time, so everybody will have about 7 minutes, and then we'll have a second panel discussion, and then we have to go to the plenary to vote. So, as my friend Benidi, the fighting against capitalism 13, we have solutions following discussion. So, it's a mad rush, but very important things to be discussed. The first to speak, being Mr. Giorgos Vassiliadis, will be listening with great interest to what the Greek government has been doing recently. And this is one aspect that perhaps people haven't been focusing on so much, despite its significance as a part of what the Syriza is trying to do in its fight against corruption. But as in other countries such as ours, Italy, in this area, we have very serious problems to attend to. So thank you, and thank you for coming.
Thanks very much indeed for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon, and I'd like to begin apologising to the interpreters that I actually left the written copy of my speech on the plane, so I can't provide you with a copy of it. Now, to talk in 7 minutes about the question of corruption in my own country, Greece, is a very considerable challenge that's been set me today. The situation in Greece, first of all. In Greece, we've had, when the economy was flourishing, we had the capitalist economic model which kind of culminated in the Olympic Games of 2004. There was corruption, and we had the problems with the mass media, the problem of the corruption as far as public contracts were concerned, and with political parties. There were also problems with the banks. So all of this together basically gave rise to a situation which, coupled with the economic crisis which began in 2008-2009, led to a situation where corruption appeared really to cover and characterize the entire country. Corruption in Greece putting it honestly and sincerely, in average terms, it's not something which differs all that much from other member states in the EU. The difference in Greek corruption is that there is a structure to it. It's not something that just affects the high levels of the economic chain in the construction industry or whatever. It actually impacts on the ordinary Greek citizen in his or her everyday life. It affects the citizens for the worse because low levels of corruption are more easily felt than the large-scale corruption in some public works. If you need to give money to a doctor or a lawyer, it's something that you feel, whereas if there's corruption in some public work, it's something that you don't notice unless it affects you directly. So with that in mind, the Greek government over the years has taken various initiatives to try to handle the problem. First of all, the Syriza government decided to carry out what they called a mapping of the country. And we ended up with a document which was over 200 pages long. So it's astonishing, really, that the country can be really controlled at all, given the highly complicated nature of its structure. So that's what the fact, I think, is it's really turning over a new page as far as the history of Greece is concerned, that Syriza has actually tried to take steps to root out corruption. From January this year, you'll probably be aware of the situation. The situation at the moment is that we are in a electoral system which in itself was already complicated, and with the memorandum, which started basically in 2010, things have got even more complicated. Remember, the central body for economic supervision, which didn't work terribly well up till before the memorandum came, has now got 1,500 inspectors. Now it's down to 700. So at the very time when we desperately need to be able to carry out inspections to follow and check black money, at the time when the memorandum policies imposed on Greece by the Troika, at the time we want to have people checking and inspecting, we've reduced their numbers by more than half. When it comes to the customs, don't forget, we are one of the countries in the EU with the longest coast. We've lost over half our employees in the customs service as well. So a country like Greece, with these problems, it's extremely difficult to try to put them right if you're depriving yourself of the manpower to do so. So we need to find the best possible solutions that we can under these extremely difficult positions. And it's very difficult for us to do anything. We can't hire anybody at the moment, so with the means at our disposal, we need to try to come up with solutions to try to bring some order back to the country, and so that people also feel that there is a kind of fairness, even under the memorandum, when people felt that the whole concept of justice had been changed in Greece. People now, in this new environment, need to feel that the government is going to be doing something to try to combat corruption and help them. So what are we doing? First of all, we're trying to raise awareness and have a sense of honour in the people who work in the public services. That's not enough in itself, of course, but we're trying to make sure that the people feel for the first time that they can work without the fear of political interference from above telling them to close their eyes to this or that. So the country, we hope, will now have direction from the political leadership that they can just get on with their jobs without interference. Now, this sounds like a really simple thing, but it could actually produce real results. The same people who were realizing that nothing they were doing was producing results just last year because of the accusations of corruption, which didn't really move forward as far as the courts were concerned. These same people who were stuck in that previous situation now feel that their work is meaningful. For the first time in Greece, the economic elite are worried because accusations and charges are being made, because we're allowing the courts to do their job. That's the first aspect. That's not going to solve everything, of course, because that feeling, of course, can evaporate, can dissipate. You might end up feeling that there's no point, and you'll get disappointed and disillusioned. So what we need to do is make sure that we see precisely what's happening with every single piece of financing the European Union provides us with. And so this economic body that I mentioned before has never in the past, for example, had to deal with money for purchasing scanners for customs before. It's the first time that that's happening thanks to the leadership of the Syriza. So that's one element. We're trying to do all we can to take advantage of all the lobbying, to try to use every single possible thing we can use to try and change things with all of the various factors and stakeholders. And by the end of the year, we hope, we will have at least 2 scanners for the Greek customs so that we can do our job. It's terrible that we can't go further than that. I think it's been calculated that a customs would really do with 20 scanners to be able to do its job properly. But with the limitations placed upon us, there are things that we want to do without having any chance of being able to do so because of a lack of money. So we can't change the direction in which the money is flowing in order to equip our customs and the bodies better. But within that difficult framework, we're doing all we can to try to facilitate the lives of ordinary people in Greece. The most significant element, the main element, I think I can say, for the Syriza government, for a left-wing government, is, well, let me put it a different way. People are waiting for justice to be done. They're waiting for people to pay for what they've done up till now, to go to prison for what they've done. The people are waiting that those who led the country into this position, the people who turned a blind eye to corruption or were involved in corruption, should actually end up in court. That's the real challenge, and I don't know whether that's going to happen. The economic framework, the way in which the money was handled, means it's not going to be easy to track it. But we do hope there will be results. But the important thing is that we should be able to put an end, to dam up all of these points which have given so many problems to the people. That's why the government's trying to bring in laws against corruption with various sections and paragraphs which will affect the whole of the public contracts in the health sector and other areas. It'll affect all of the public administration in the entire country. We don't want the phenomena to flourish again with new protagonists. So what we want to do is, on the one hand, provide social justice and literal justice, on the other hand, putting an end to what happened in the past, filling up the holes, the gaps, trying to move forward and reshaping the machinery by which the country is run. This law, which I mentioned, is 250, or the report which you mentioned was 250 pages long, looking at the way the country was organised and run, and that's something we need to try and do something about now. It's obviously far from clear because of the complexity of the situation, but the government needs to work every day at every level. I'm sorry I overran. I probably tired you out a bit, but thanks very much. And if any questions, I'd be happy to try and field them.
Thank you. Very interesting. I think that with Marco Travaglio, we'll talk about how important that message is for the governments to act legally and not illegally. And now we'll be hearing from Francesco Forgione, who's going to talk about the Anti-Mafia Parliamentary Committee. So I think you'll tell us the mafia has gone global at a very quick speed, and the anti-mafia efforts are finding it hard to keep up, at least here in Europe, to do a proper job effectively. Thank you. Thank you to Curzio Maltese for having organized this meeting. It's his initiative. We really do need to do some serious thinking about the subject of the mafia and how to fight it in a European dimension. Partly because if we want to overcome the criminal exclusive domain and the magistrates in trying to fight this phenomenon, when it comes to our country, it is really part of public life for more than a century and a half. And we need to come back and think about the very nature of power and the very nature of economic power and the relationship between the two and society. And I think the left, in the broad sense, the cultural world and democratic forces, what can we do? But I think over the past years, we've really not had this independent ability to understand the unfolding mechanisms and how the economy is changing, the critical glance at power, and not even really properly grasping the phenomenon of abuse, and particularly when it's not always seen as a criminal activity, but rather one that goes with the very nature, the very being of a being in the elite that decides for the rest of society. This meeting, I think, can help us do that. And this really is a cultural battle that needs to be waged. It's two different cultural views of the world. When it comes to the north of Italy, for example, the question of the mafia is seen as something that concerns the south. When it comes to the rest of Europe, it is seen as being an Italian problem. So it's a matter of shifting this cultural value, seeing it as just a way of life rather than analyzing what the mafia really represent today. If we sit down and think about the price tag of this in the Bank of Italy, the criminal activity, mafia activities, it's about 180 billion euros probably. Now, if that is the sum, and the Bank of Italy does use that figure, the problem is to determine what the limit is between the legal and the illegal economy, because 50 or 60% of that amount of wealth is reinserted in the legal economy. And the first question I think we need to ask ourselves in analyzing the Berlusconi world, many books have been written on the subject, but over the past 20 years, this Berlusconi universe, this ultra-liberal universe, has undergone a process of total and utter deregulation of the market mechanisms, breaking down any form of control or oversight in the way that capital can be used. And this has allowed the mafias to get involved in the overall economy and to move about with a huge amount of capital. Outside of the traditional areas of control and the regions and Calabria, Campania, Sicily are the traditional areas where the mafia, but they've been able to break down those barriers with increased economic and financial presence elsewhere, and also in the entrepreneurial world. And we have to see the twofold relationship where they do control the entire territory in those areas where the mafia do act hegemoniously with a total stranglehold on the society and the economic life, and then how they can project themselves elsewhere to other regions. At both levels, there's this different perception of how dangerous the phenomenon is to society at large, and the feeling of alarm in trying to build a reaction to counter them. Now, the traditional areas are easier to grasp. What we have to try to do is to track down the mafia where it cannot be seen, where we really don't perceive the violent dimension of what they do. However, this violent dimension is there, and it's the hypocrisy of the leading classes that to refuse to see it because they don't want to see it. They can't find it because they're not looking. And in the 1900s, very quickly, to go in the past, throughout the 1900s, if you follow the fight against the mafia, to better understand it, you have to understand migration from Calabria, from Sicily, and from Campania. The nucleus of immigration led to the first mafia strongholds being created with the Cosa Nostra, even in the U.S. With globalization, what we need is to follow the financial flows. Throughout the 1970s, we saw this quantum leap, the Europe of the mafia, including Italy, started to move towards the drug smuggling and cigarette smuggling routes, which led to a shift of these main criminal markets. The huge cocaine market, for example, where the 'Ndrangheta from Naples is the major broker internationally. And I think that in this shift in their international role between the Cosa Nostra and the 'Ndrangheta, I don't know if my colleagues will agree, there's the fact that the Cosa Nostra has been straitjacketed by the Corleones nationally in the relationship between the political mafia between Andreotti and in its dealings with the Second Republic in Italy. Well, that's another subject when it comes to their influence in the government, but also internationally. The Cosa Nostra from Italy for years had a monopoly when it comes to heroin trafficking. And in Sicily, you had the cooperation with the labs in Marseille, going to the east, coming to work in Sicily and in the U.S. And the Cosa Nostra was locked into the national mechanism, and on the international market, however, this mafia appeared on the scene, and they had so much money in the 'Ndrangheta that was available. They were rich. It was a closed circuit, and they didn't have these small laboratories. The Sicilians, of course, had also been devastated by people turning them in, insiders, and then they were able to branch out to Peru, to Ecuador, and today in Mexico. The cocaine trade is fundamental because it's one of the major sources of accumulated wealth. A kilo of cocaine from Colombia is bought at 1,500 euros, but that same kilo is 15 to 20,000 euros in Europe. When it gets to the hands of the Calabrians, well, we still call it coca, not cocaine. That kilo is worth 40 or 50,000 euros. But then when it's sold, that kilo of pure cocaine, here I'm talking about pure coca, it produces 4 kilos of cocaine, which of course is cut and processed. And each of these 4 kilos, emblematically in the on the market, typically it is worth 50,000 euros. What did we start with? 1,500 euros. Well, Marx would have said there is no good that can produce an added value of 1,500 up to 250,000 euros. So where's the problem? When you're talking about this major anti-drugs operation, usually drugs trafficking is a cross-border affair. People are arrested, or 2 Colombians, 1 Spanish citizen, 4 from Naples, and a handful of Spaniards. Fine, but normally we're getting the criminal dimension at the street level, those who are dealing with transport, purchase, and the sale. But never do you get the organization behind it, behind the scenes, the financial flows behind them, because you have those that live in the criminal world, but the other parts that live in the economic and financial world, the political world, which is entirely above board and legal, well, in banks. And the subject that we have to deal with is how can we hit the mafia at that level? In Europe, the mafia arrived on the scene in the 50s and 60s. Duisburg drew attention to them with the 2007 tragedy in mid-August. But it was back in the 1950s, and the police in Germany wrote a famous report, the Sanluca report, which in detail describes the activities of the Calabrians in Germany, in restaurants, pizzerias, import-export businesses, managing drug trafficking. And the German police forces wrote about this in 2000, and they sent that report to the Italian police, dealing with that only after there was that attack in 2007. In 2009, they then updated that same report, but the problem remains an Italian problem. Duisburg, became a strategic period in time because there are 3 ports, Hamburg, Rotterdam, and Antwerp. Hamburg, Rotterdam, and Antwerp are the corresponding, there's a 4th and even a 5th port, Gioia Tauro, for all of the transit towards the east, and together with Piraeus. But there's the problem also that was referred to by our Greek colleague, 1,500 checks per year on containers that come in from the Atlantic. In Piraeus, 150. And Europe has to decide how to fight this phenomenon with the same instruments, with the same intensity, the same desire. Spain, 3 more minutes, if I may. Just 1. Okay. No, I finished. No, we really do have a limited time. I would invite you not to simply go into numerous examples. Just 1 minute, then. Just 1 minute. This global dimension has a political side to it. Nobody remembers nowadays that it was a senator, who went to prison. Girolamo, senator, was elected to the College of Europe for Forza Italia. He was linked to a man who keeps coming up, who's a Mokbel, who was a black financier, and he was working for the 'Ndrangheta. And why was he a candidate to be elected? Because controlling the communities is carried out not only for social reasons, but it's also political control. These lists in South America there are 2, Auto Michique, who comes from Venezuela. He's come for 20 years, since 2008. And Marcelo De Luta is another one, who's made hundreds of telephone calls determining who is a candidate for the post. Not Giancarlo Caselli, but another friend called Caselli, who is the head of the Chamber of Commerce of Buenos Aires, who has ties with the old dictatorship and the generals, who has decided by the 'Ndrangheta man to control this. So to conclude, I think we really need to tackle these problems, and knowing that here in Europe, when the money comes in from the mafia, you're going to eat very well in the pizzerias in Sicily and Calabria, but when the money comes in, the mafia comes in. And when the mafia comes in, they start to take control of the territory. And what is needed is a fight against this phenomenon, which basically works with the same tools everywhere, to get the property, trade, and capital, and a stranglehold on all 3. With the very same approach to seize their assets with all legal means, which can be different, but the criminal activities are becoming less and less effective, and we need to counter that. In Italy, we recently received the Lisbon Directive. The Vatican, I think, was the last country dealing with money laundering. So, the European Parliament really needs to react. There's a need for a group such as the GUE group to understand that these subjects of fighting against organized crime have nothing to do just with enforcement or security. It has to do with the economic nature of enterprise and the marketplace and the economy. This fight, we need to take it out of the courts' political domain and bring it to a social and political scene. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Now we're going to hear from Massimo Bongiovanni, who's a lawyer, and hope he won't speak for quite as long. And it's very difficult for the interpreters if people speak so quickly.
Pochissimo.
Well, 7 minutes isn't very long. I'll try to take you on a voyage, on a trip. Given what I saw in what I will tell you, let me remind you of what Falcone said, the judge. He said, if you want to find the mafia, follow the money trail. Experience has shown us, well, a colleague here representing Lord Patrizio has explained, it's not just the mafia. There are other criminal groups that make use of the mafia, particularly at the top ranks of the state. Now, we've discovered through a special investigation for dealing with the scandal that hit the Italian government at the beginning of 2015, which hit the Ministry for Infrastructure and Transport. This Ministry for Transport and Infrastructure is the one that manages the most of public money, particularly those of you here in the European Parliament will be aware of public funds from Europe as well. Organized crime isn't just about the mafia. It also includes a number of other criminal associations, not branded as the mafia, but working closely with those at the top of the state. Now, I've referred to this investigative ordinance, which sparked off the Minister Lupi's dismissal. He had to leave following the scandal. He met, there was in Calza, he was an engineer who, for about 25 years, was in charge of the Ministry for Infrastructure. Mr. Incalza basically was the one, well, he wasn't officially all throughout that time, but he was the acting Minister for Infrastructure. I'm covering a lot of ground very quickly. I hope interpreters can keep up. But I want to refer to the committee, the Interministerial Committee for Economic Planning, which is the decision-making body in the Italian state, at the top of the decision-making in Italy. And you have the participation of the Minister for Infrastructure, the Economic and Finance Minister, the Environmental Minister, and other competent ministers are all part of this in any works that are to be approved. The CIPE, this committee is like a huge tap for funding. It is governing the greatest amount of finance in Italy. And in the CIPE, this Intergovernmental Committee for Economic Planning, through nominations and appointments of head people at its head, has had great influence. And the speaker before me can say there's a certain man, Nicola Cosentino. I think that he's under house arrest. But anyway, Nicola Cosentino had been appointed the secretary and the subsecretary of the presidency of the Council of Ministers, as well as this interministerial committee for economic planning. So he was really controlling these financial flows in the government. At the top as well, another man who's often talked about, don't confuse him with his brother, But he had a specific task within one of the major Italian banks, San Paolo. His name is Michiche, but Gianfranco Michiche, not his brother. But he's been often discussed. But I mean, these aren't the only ones at the top managing public finance and managing the major financial amounts going to the major works of the state, paid for by taxpayers, paid for by the citizens. But these individuals were able to make use of a special law that was designed and even submitted to the Parliament. It's the so-called Legge Obiettivo, which is a sort of infrastructure law, number 443, the Framework Infrastructure Act, and saying that it is only the Infrastructure Ministry that decides without an awards procedure that is based on a contest or public procurement. And following this act, it was possible to manage more than 200 billion euros, not for public interest, but in public interest name. And this law, 443, the infrastructure law, works outside of the state bodies, outside of the public administration, and is able to decide which public works will get financed, which major works should be approved to go ahead, and it is under the name, in the name of simplification. That's never a good thing, because when you simplify, this will reduce the checks and balances and the information that will help you to shape the decisions for the major works. The decision-making, particularly when it comes to the use of this so-called Legge Obiettivo, the Framework Infrastructure Act, not done by public administration, by people outside of the public administration deciding, the general contractor, for example, who decides whether or not certain works can be included in the infrastructure program, the strategic infrastructure program. It's rather complex, that part of my story. So I would like you to focus on this artifice, this trick that allowed them to use laws created for that specific purpose to exert influence over the Parliament and on behalf of the citizens. And in this case, referring to the Val di Susa, which was against the high-speed trade protest. Now, the public administration had to work with this interministerial committee for economic planning to determine which works should be financed. What are the collective interests that represented in these works to be financed? Now, this ordinance confirmed what the mechanisms would be for managing public funds, even those coming from the EU. Now, this man in Calza is an individual, well, who over the phone was able to speak to Minister Lubi, and he reassured him, saying, "Watch out, you're going to have to be careful, because some people are saying that they want to kick you out of the infrastructure ministry." And Lupi reassured him, saying, over the phone, in this phone conversation, if they send you away, well, I'll take the government down with me. Well, you can see just how powerful this Mr. Incalza felt, who was actually managing 200 billion euros. And this leads me to the question of the high-speed train between Turin and Lyon, France. Incalza did something that nobody else ever managed to do. I don't know if you're aware of the fight against the high-speed train between Turin and Lyon in the Val Susini. But in 2005, the Prodi government, or rather in 2006, decided to take this project out of this Legge Obiettivo. It's no longer recognized as part of strategic interest in the decision-making process through an administrative approval procedure, approving these works. Now, Incalza managed, despite that, through his offices. In fact, he works in the Technical Specifications Board, and he managed to update this law, law number 443, in the most incredible way. He was able to insert in an update of a law a special community directive, Chapter 5 of Law 2006, calling for inclusion of this Technical Specifications Board. And in creating this Technical Specifications Board, he was able to convince the government and the Interministerial Committee for Economic Planning to apply the objective law, to come back within the scope of that Strategic Infrastructure Act. And ICAT told this Committee for Economic Planning that this high-speed train never was taken out of the scope of that law, although that is wrong. And in this note, he cited a document, and it's a shame that the document says exactly the opposite. In the 7th of 2013, it contained the strategic infrastructure groups, and there were tables, and it explicitly says that this high-speed train connection was not included. Now, this technical note of the Technical Specifications Board was taken to the administrative court, and they believed him. He produced piles of documentation and a parliamentary study dating back to 2011, in which they had indicated that this high-speed train had been excluded from that Infrastructure Act. I'm going to have to make this short. Now, why was it taken out? Well, certainly not to exclude the people, but rather to guarantee the public procurement would take place correctly in 2005, whereas under this Infrastructure Act, that would be taken out of public procurement, and that was approved in 2010 by the Committee for Economic Planning. But by placing it back in the Infrastructure Act, it was able then to get a new contract with breathing new life into it. So it went to the hands of 'Ndrangheta, and so the same people were awarded this, and a note was then sent during the investigations in San Michele, trying to fight the 'Ndrangheta in the Piedmont region. But they did raise this question about how is it possible to maintain the validity of that public procurement through this note that was sent to them. I mean, it's crazy, but the same report of that Carabinieri department confirmed that 'Ndrangheta was present on the works, but they were being overseen very strictly. And in this ordinance from the court in Turin, it was discovered that 'Ndrangheta was within these works in Piedmont for the high-speed train, and even going beyond what the local police had asked for. Now, it turned out that the 'Ndrangheta, how is it possible they were working within the most monitored works? There are controls and there are rules, but there's not always the desire to follow through. You don't always have the public administration to follow through, particularly when it comes to the presence of the 'Ndrangheta. And even the local police knew that this was a man from the 'Ndrangheta, and he was actually part of the San Michele trials. So the police were aware of this. They knew it because they requested that particular part of the itinerary be removed. And it was possible for them to work there because they received the authorization from the local, and that company in charge of the high-speed train was aware of this because they approved of the contract. Now I can refer to the 20th of October 2011. The person representing the 'Ndrangheta who decided that this would be the itinerary, states that he was forced to hide because the Italian television was present and he did not want to be seen on Italian television. You can say, is this man unknown? No, everybody knew who he was, as I pointed out earlier. So these controls that were not taking place, any public work has its code, has its mechanism to fight against mafia influence and to control the financial flows. But in this high-speed train between Turin and Lyon, they were inactive for almost 2 years. And the anti-mafia measures did not apply for that high-speed rail track. I'm not the only one to say so. The president of the anti-corruption unit, Cantone, said so in 2012. There's a special agreement between France and Italy saying that even on the Italian territory part, the contract, the French law would apply. And therefore, the French law has no anti-mafia measures. There are no special rules to fight against organized crime like the mafia, and therefore it was French law that applied, and where there were these agreements, they didn't want to hold things up, so the Italian parliament ratified this agreement, which entirely keeps the Italian authorities away from the ability to control these contracts. Thank you.
Per chi a questo punto avesse bisogno di generi.
Thanks very much. If anybody wants a coffee or something, we do have some over there. We're already actually late, and that's going to eat into question time. But I turn now to Marco Travaglio, our next speaker. Thanks very much. I'll be very brief, telling you a few things about the Expo in Milan. It's been talked up as a fantastic triumph, but the facts actually give rise to a rather different interpretation. Was there something behind the Expo? And it began, as you know, on the 1st of May and ended on October the 30th. It's one of a series of universal expositions. Hanover in 2004 was supposed to be the biggest flops ever, with only 19 million visitors, and in fact we had exactly the same number of visitors, 19 million in Milan. So perhaps this is going to be the flop of the 21st century. So what's actually happened? It starts, of course, with the purchase of private land by public money, even though it's the authorities in Milan are actually fairly well provided with land of their own. 160 million euro was spent in purchasing the land. The market price is 10 times lower than that, so the public money spent on this is already hugely more than market prices. 1.3 billion was spent on doing this up, part from the state and part from the region, and this was in a sort of sinking fund, and the money has basically been lost. The total public money commitment for the major work, it's being demolished as we speak, since the Expo is now over. It amounts to 2.4 billion euros. According to the first calculations which our newspaper did, apart from the 1.3 billion which was in the sinking fund and has basically gone, there's going to be another €500 million gap. And the local authorities and the regional authorities will have to pay the banks who advanced the money for the money which was spent on buying the land in the first place, with interest that's now 200 million euros. The original idea was that some of the land could be reused. The original figure was 6 million euros. It's now risen to 72 million, and no one knows who actually wants to pay this. Will the public end up paying the tab? It's entirely possible that they will. And this is, don't forget, paying for something that's already being demolished, and there won't be any trace of it at the end. The land which was already cabled and had access for internet, etc., all on it has been auctioned off, and nobody was really at the auction at all. The person basically in charge of the expo, a kind of commissioner, big events are given to a major commissioner, basically so that there won't be any democratic control, and a month before it was supposed to start, he said it was going to break even, because he said we needed to sell the tickets at 23 euros. Then he said they could make do with 19 euros as the price, as long as they sold enough tickets, but they ended up selling them at an average price of 10 euros. Since no one actually started to go to the expo, they started giving tickets away to elderly people, to parties of school children, and to anybody who turned up in the evening, just to puff up the number of people going. But of course, that meant the actual profitability of the whole thing was reduced, since nobody was paying for their tickets. All of this kind of stuff was the original attendances, for example, were kept secret, as this is some kind of massive state secret, and when the figures were released, they were greatly inflated. People coming and going to the expo in order to work were counted as visitors, for example. Carlo Petrini from Slow Food ended up providing some services which weren't even paid for, even though some major multinationals were supposed to be dealing with some of that sort of thing. And some of the companies who were given jobs under this were somewhat dubious, shall we say. You would think if you're going to spend 2.4 billion euros, you should probably, say, think about building a little park which might attract a few more people. Only 16% of the visitors were foreigners, and 40% of all the visitors actually came from Lombardy, so they weren't spending any money on hotels, etc. They'd simply visit and go back home. So the huge number of visitors that were promised never materialized. They said there was going to be 1 million people from China going, and didn't even see 100,000. Now, what do we do with all of this expo land, since, as I said before, nobody wants to buy it? Actually, now Prime Minister Renzi wants to provide another 1 billion euros over the next 10 years in order to build a technological centre, the scientific relevance of which is dubious. We've already got a centre like this in Genoa, but it would only actually cover 60,000 square metres, and the whole expo site is 1 million. It'll basically be a little kiosk in an enormous desert. But the money, we are told, is available, and that's obviously partly because the elections are coming up. It's going to be called the Human Technopole Italy 2040. I have no idea what that means, but that's what it's going to be called. The scientific authorities and the institutions, the scientific institutions in Milan, are very unimpressed with this whole idea. The idea of bringing something up from Genoa to Milan when in Milan they're already carrying out high-level research strikes them as being very silly. The High Commissioner who's in charge of all of this is under Giuseppe Zallo, and he will be the centre-right candidate for mayor of Milan. Mr. Sala, and this is what links us to today's topic, selected a staff for the expo, almost all of whom have ended up in prison. He's actually the only one who's free. Antonio Rognoni, who is dealing with infrastructures, is under arrest. Angelo Pari, his right-hand man, is under arrest. Antonio Acerbo, sub-commissioner is under arrest, Andrea Castellotti, who's a facility manager, whatever that is. I don't know what a facility manager is. He's under arrest too. Though obviously he doesn't have a certain facility with something. Someone else, Pietro Galli, is free, but he's actually already been convicted of fraudulent bankruptcy. And that something, I think, if you select people like this who return your faith in this particular way, you would think your judgment will be called into question, but Salah's actually going to be promoted. So the story of the Expo is basically a huge amount of money spent on something which is basically useless. It's being, as I said, demolished or dismantled 6 months on. A huge amount of money, a huge amount of bribery. A large number of arrests have been made. Some people famous, basically, for bribing. People who were actually involved in the famous Bribesville scandal back in 1992. The only people who seem not to have remembered that these people were notorious for giving and taking bribes was Mr. Salah, the High Commissioner in charge of all of this. Gian Stefano Frigerio, for example, who was dealing with the bribing of the right, and Luigi Grillo, who was bribing people in the centre. These are people who have already been condemned for influence peddling and bribery, but in Italy, these same people keep coming up over and over again in situations like this, no matter what the courts say. So, the bribery was discovered even before Expo was built, because this all came to light. But people have said that because it's so urgent to get it built, we need to forget about all the regulations that would normally apply. The High Commissioner basically suspends democracy, if you like, in the area which he controls. The press is basically paid off with huge numbers of Expo adverts. 60 million euros were spent, and over 500 articles were produced in the newspapers. These are paid for articles, don't forget. Multiply them by over 180 newspapers. All of these were virtually fulsome in their praise of the Expo. There was very little criticism, because they're basically publishing paid adverts for the Expo. The legal system, who were working well before Expo, suddenly mysteriously ground to a halt. They actually might either got through their work by the 1st of May, which happened to be the day that the Expo opened, or they felt it was only appropriate to stop what they were doing for the time being. And indeed, one of the magistrates was even transferred to Turin so that he wouldn't rock the boat during this triumphal 3 months. And in fact, Renzi, after the Expo, thanked the main prosecutor in Milan for the sensitive way in which he'd handled things. I thought that people who broke the law would necessarily have to be charged. I don't really see why Renzi was thanking the main prosecutor in Milan. Now, as I've said, Mr. Sala is going to be Renzi's chosen candidate as a kind of chosen Trojan horse to continue to control the city. He's saying he's a manager rather than a politician. And this now might be exported not just to national level, this kind of model, but at European level, so we should be very careful.
Purtroppo non c'è molto tempo per le domande.
It's a great pity we don't have time for questions. We can take 2 or 3 and no more than that. Well, if not, I've got a question myself. How can it be that in a few years the media is no longer publishing accurate figures? About the Expo, for example. people were unanimously saying it was a success, and none of the figures used to back this up were accurate. Reply. I think, as I said, it's the paid-for adverts. The press, particularly the paper press, is in crisis. The more readers they lose, the less questions they tend to ask. There's been a hemorrhage of readership, and they're trying to staunch it with adverts. And it's not really investment anymore, because if you buy a page in a paper, you don't just buy that page, you basically buy the entire paper. The doses of Expo adverts, as I said, were channeled towards papers which they thought would speak well of it. And there were some newspapers which started being critical and got a few adverts and changed their tune. And there were some other ones which kind of did a bit of humming and hawing about it so as not to look bad, but they were still taking Expo money. And the talk shows basically homogenize all invitations. So if you say that Expo is a success, or you're given the same amount of airtime as people who say it's a flop, nobody was asked to back up what they were saying when they claimed it was a success, whereas the people who said they were flop were regarded as being some owl, literally, as Mr. Renzi, a word that he uses to attack people who disagree with him. It means basically a rather sad, pathetic person who wants to bring everybody else down. So anyone who spreads bad news is an enemy of happiness as far as Renzi is concerned. This kind of allergy to figures is really verging on the ludicrous. In the last few years, because for a few days, as I say, given that they were giving the tickets away, there were huge barbarian hordes who were storming the Expo, trying to get into the Oman and Dubai pavilions, where there's actually nothing to see, as you would expect. But the important thing was it was free. And so there were 7 or 8 hours of queues if you wanted to go into some of these pavilions. One satirical program sent a correspondent who went from the centre of Milan and tried to go to the Milan to see the Qatar pavilion, and another person actually tried to go to the real Qatar, and the person who took the aeroplane got there first. He got there before the correspondent trying to get to the Qatar pavilion. He took 7 hours as opposed to 6 on the plane. But if you really think about it, 6 hours in a queue, in anywhere else it would be regarded as a triumph of absurdity and bad organisation. But in Italy, people are saying congratulations to these people who managed to hold out for 7 hours in a queue. I mean, in a normal country you'd find that funny, but in Italy people don't laugh about this. When someone said that people in a queue should be a kind of national monument in Rome, people didn't really realise what he was trying to say. Thank you. Thanks very much. There are some MEPs, Barbara, Leonora, and someone from 5 Star here. Good afternoon. Do you want to say anything? Or if there are any questions from the floor? Because then we've got a second panel. Which will be run by Lorenzo Robustelli. Barbara, thanks very much. I apologise for arriving late. My question to Marco is what you've told us, or what all the colleagues have told us, confirm the idea of widespread corruption and the presence of the mafia and the 'ndrangheta in public contract awards in Italy, and the way the newspapers have behaved is what was told by Marco, but also something which has come back into the headlines in the last few days is that the whole idea of the Palermo process isn't working at all. People are now saying that things are going to change. Manino, yeah, that's it. Which has strengthened the hand of those people who have said that the idea of a state infiltrated by mafia corruption is simply an idea of certain journalists. How can you explain this quite obviously ridiculous theory? You've got the idea of advertising, and the expo, is there some kind of generalized publicity from the mafia which buys off journalists? Well, I think you can explain it really with this need for optimism which turns into mandatory optimism. And we're talking about Falcone and Borsellino. We look at them as saints, but we're not looking at why they were murdered and what they achieved. We're learning more about the mafia because of supergrasses. The mafia have told us more about the mafia than the state has managed to uncover. And so it was a kind of exercise in pessimism and this bringing everybody down, as Renzi put it, in this. The law, the ruling from the court, if it says that Manino didn't actually carry out what he was accused of doing, if you look at, say, Perugia, what happened there, where Meredith Kercher was murdered, and the two accused were Amanda Knox and Alfredo Sollecito were cleared. But that, of course, doesn't mean that she wasn't killed. It means that there was a crime. The crime is murder, but there isn't sufficient proof that the two accused did it. Someone else might have done it, or will never come up with sufficient evidence to say that the two accused did it. That's what the ruling means, and the same thing happens in the Manino case. There's not enough evidence that he did what he was supposed to have done, but given that there are 10 politicians who were supposed to have been killed, but weren't after Salvo Lima was murdered, so there are 10 other people involved. The judge said that there has been a crime committed, even though we don't know whether Manino actually committed it. So let's see with the next wave of trials if we can find out who is guilty. What's wrong is that now people are saying that these people are actually innocent. So you could, going back to the Meredith Kercher case, you can either say that she's still alive or committed suicide, and that doesn't make any sense at all. If you talk about it, a homicide case, in a murder case in those terms, its ridiculousness becomes obvious. But the same thing is equally true of the Manino case, in my opinion. You can't say that the state and the mafia are completely unconnected. It's just a kind of cowboys and Indian thing. It's a highly optimistic thing. It's not really the kind of thing that Mr. Renzi wouldn't approve of.
Sì, anche io ringrazio Curzio e...
I'd like to thank you, Chairman, and the speakers for this discussion which we've had. It's extremely significant for the reasons Francesco Forgione adduced in what he said, because we need to shape opinions about corruption and about the mafia, and to stop people believing that it simply applies to the south and doesn't affect the whole of Europe. I believe that as a political group it's important that we try to deal with this. We've got strong connections between corruption processes and developmental models. I don't think it's a coincidence that 3 useless pieces of public works, the bridge over the strait and the Expo and the high-speed train, have all been linked strongly to corruption cases. Because one of the nexuses which we as a left-wing group should think about a lot is that corruption isn't politically neutral. It is very closely linked to the kind of developmental model that is being pushed by the Italian government and which we strongly object to. So my question is on the links between the political system and the communications industry. Everyone knows, I'm saying this to the non-Italians here,
In Italia c'è un grande dibattito.
there's a huge debate in these weeks on what's called capital mafia. The solution that the Italian government is putting forward for this is the Expo type model that could be done for the Jubilee, for example, and having non-politicians involved in these kind of decisions. I'd like to understand how our speakers read the link between Milan and Rome, between what's happened in Milan with the Expo and what's happening in Rome right now, whether we're going to see the exporting of the Expo model, which isn't actually another reason for very deep concern. Thanks. Let me just say one thing. The fascinating thing is that the Expo model is one of utter corruption. And it's a model of utter corruption which has the advantage of being a new model of total corruption with a lot of media consensus behind it. It's corruption that's been organised down to the finest detail, really. Francesco, do you have anything to say about that? Yeah, the whole press campaign on the Marino case was linked to this. The need to remove a mayor who'd made mistakes, admittedly, but look at De Luca, who's still in charge down in Campania, but there's certainly no legal reason to remove him. We'll see what happens when the case ends up in court. But we've had a campaign where they said it was impossible to govern Rome, so we'd have a special commissariat in charge of things and having a prefect. And the first thing that the prefect did was that he went out onto a balcony and greeted the crowd as if he'd been elected by people, which of course he hadn't. He'd been appointed by the public administration. The other commissioner now, who's in charge of the Jubilee preparations, is the same kind of person in the same kind of situation. The suspension of politics, the suspension of representative government, letting companies run everything with no oversight, with no control over the flows of public money is what this all boils down to. In almost all regional governments, the national government says who's going to assess the budget, for example. So you have one of these commissars or commissioners and the person in charge of the budget coming from central authority. I think there's excessive work even in the Anti-Corruption Commission. It can't be a kind of supreme court for every kind of problem related to public contracts. What we need to do is go back to the legitimate roles of those bodies that have been sidelined in the last few years because they say we need to move things quickly, we need to keep everybody optimistic and cheerful. We need to go back to the old system. We've got a second panel which looks like being as fascinating as this one, so we're going to have to stop, although we've actually stolen a bit of their time. Thanks very much.
Sì, buonasera.
Good afternoon. Sorry to call you all back to order, but we have less than 45 minutes because we have to leave the room because of parliamentary rules. At 6:45, we have to free the room. This is an interesting panel, so please take your seats so we can get underway. Oh, I've lost my glasses. The subject of this second panel is the social impact of organized crime. The next step, compared to what's been done so far at the political level, in the courts, and now we're talking about grassroots, the citizens. We have three individuals to tell us about what they're up to daily. Mr. Lorenzo Frigerio, the first here on the left-hand side, who's the coordinator of the group known as Libera Observazione. Libera being, of course, an association fighting against the mafia, denouncing facts and news linked to criminal networks. And we journalists, of course, sometimes just gloss over the surface. We don't really go into detail. This is often the accusation. Following him, we'll hear from Anna Riccarde from Scampia. This is an average-size school in Scampia. Well, there was a big movement of young people, young boys and girls, trying to organize themselves to shape their destiny along different lines, like many others in their town of Scampia. And then Mr. Franco Iannello, he's from Brussels, the president of Culture Against the Camorra, an organization here in Brussels tackling the problem of organized crime from a rather unique angle, a structural approach, a new approach, using cultural weapons. But he'll be in a better position to explain how his activities work and what they're all about. It's a very lively and intense plan. Hope successful as well. So, Lorenzo, would you like to get started? Of course, you have about 7 minutes. We would like some time for questions. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. Well, the first of three, well, Franconi, Borsellino, starting with them, because without the blood that's been shed because of the inability to do a better job, most Italian citizens would continue to suffer from the mafia, and to see this as something of very little impact on their daily lives, not something they have to tackle directly. Now, people hate the violent act, but Libra probably wouldn't have even come to exist. It was born on the 25th of March of 1995 with the objective of bringing together groups and to look at all related facts and events that have to do with organized crime. It is a legal democratic group that is enshrined in the Constitution. Formerly, it was just the first step for a long and complex journey to work to better understand and better fight. We've reached a point of no return in our country. Many people were asking about what the strategy should be in order to combat mafia violence, particularly to hit the more credible representatives of the state that feels utterly incapable of fighting against, for example, the magistrature in Milan and other great events, trying to shed light on the widespread corruption. We just have a few minutes to talk about what we've been doing over 20 years. That's going to be a tough, very tall order, given the social fight, given the direct and immediate action on a daily basis. The first initiative that was started was getting 1 million signatures of Italian citizens to approve a law, Law 109 of 1996, allowing for the use of confiscated goods for social purposes. The seized goods, the confiscated goods of illegal sources, of mafia and corrupt sources, real estate and money given to the state's local communities for work, the schools, social services, and the disabled can benefit. The first day, remembering the 21st of March, well, it's now the 20th anniversary since the first event in Bologna. We had in March the last event. Many activities have taken place following special initiatives. This special day of effort, alongside the work with the confiscated works, which is another pillar of Libra's activities. Every year, we have the names of the victims, the innocent victims of the Vanya, reading them out, and in this long list, we have family members who come along. 75% of the family members of the victims of the mafia attacks don't know the truth. They don't know why their loved ones were killed. Since 1996, we had a long journey of different initiatives. We had the Libera Terra initiative. Marco said, referring to products that are the result of cooperatives work, type B, that use disabled work and also working on land confiscated from the mafia. And the first fields, we had 5,000 volunteers coming from all parts of Europe who came to work on the confiscated lands, confiscated from the mafia. 2007, Libera Informazione was born, We have the two Director Generals that called for this initiative from the world of journalism, Roberto Moroni and Santo Della Volpe. They are no longer with us, sadly. They have passed on. Their last years of life were devoted to this struggle. They felt it was very necessary. And Marco Travaglio told us that information in Italy isn't getting through. And this was an opportunity, for example, to shed light on what happened following the Milan Expo. Now, speaking of what happened in Europe, the first network that brings together different associations at a European level, over recent years, they've been fighting corruption, and there was the future plan that was launched. These activities have also led to meetings. When it comes to Libra's activity, we want to bring it all together, the social fight against the mafia in Europe, a first meeting with the approval of Directive 42 of the 3rd of April of 2014, dealing with confiscated goods Europe-wide. This should be implemented because we realize that there is a difference between legal laws in the civil law in common law countries, for example, but the concept which is at the heart of this initiative, that the revenue of crime should go back to the community in the form of a social project, is very close to our hearts. Other questions at a European level, when it comes to the awareness-raising campaigns over the past years, we had one here in Brussels, another event in Paris and in London, in Switzerland. The idea is that we need to work to spread the message, to spread awareness of what can be done to fight the mafia working with property, and in the memory of the memory of this effort on the 21st of March. And other questions, the battle being waged for a European directive dealing with whistleblowing, which involves everything relating to corruption. This has a great deal to do with the question of organized crime, of course. Report 162, which is part of the Maxim Francone Borsellino trial, and we can recall the other victims on the 21st of March, but something was written saying that the protection of the mafia is not the result of the number of their associates, but because other people who are involved who are able to make use of related activities and the availability of a vast grey zone. The revenue from the mafia is available to this grey area that benefits from it, and we must tackle it because otherwise their resources are endless. We need to recall in what we were told before, that the link between mafia-type organized crime and corruption, this is something that the European Union needs to take more seriously, because the question of the mafia isn't just a matter of the south of Italy, as we heard Francesco Forgione say earlier, or it's not just an Italian matter, it's gone global, it's a worldwide affair, and the first worldwide network of being drug trafficking when it comes to corruption. I'll conclude because I'm starting to come to the end of my allotted speaking time, but the battle that Libra will continue to fight will involve that, or also when it comes to money laundering, trying to fight environmental crime, and particularly anything that can be useful, special tools to strengthen Europol and Eurojust and other anti-mafia prosecutor to fight organized crime specifically. It's true that Italy has exported the mafia throughout Europe and the world, but Italy also has a set of special rules and regulations to fight the mafia, and we have the social and civil society, not just Libera, but other associations have been working very hard over the years.
Grazie, Lorenzo.
Thanks very much, Lorenzo. I'm very glad that Libera is keen now to extend its struggle to the European level, and I do hope that people will listen to what you've got to say. Now I turn to Anna Riccardi. And it links in, I think, what she's going to tell us to what Lorenzo just said. The idea that we can measure organised crime in terms of how closely they're interwoven with the social fabric, and that's what Anna is going to tell us about. I'd like to thank Curzio Maltese for having invited me, and I'm representing Virgilio 4. It's a school in a place called Scampia in Italy. It is a co-educational school, and last year an MEP, Curzio Maltese, in fact came to see us. And we will soon be sending a party to visit the European Parliament, because it wasn't just a formal exchange of visits. It's something that we think is quite significant, because Scampia is Italy, is Europe, and Europe is Scampia. So what I'm going to tell you about, which I hope will be a contribution to this fascinating debate, which began earlier today and will continue with Lorenzo's fascinating statement, is what's happening at everyday level. Curzio Maltese started by quoting Roberto Benigni, but I want to talk about my little town, which is got so-called 7 palaces in it. There's another part of Scampia called the Third World. Words are important, and the part that's represented by my school is therefore a fairly typical urban area. And if you come to an airport, you often see rather beautiful photographs of the place you're visiting. My school is actually a fairly ugly place, because there are iron gates before you can even get into it, and it gives you an idea of the whole way that the cities are being built now in terms of urban architecture. I started my job here several years ago, and it was something I was quite worried about, because the idea of education and schools, which was something where you really felt you could make a difference, was something that attracted me. So I was able, by going to this place, to get a contract which lasted for several years and not a rolling 1-month contract. If you try to look at this objectively and not get emotionally involved, the children realise what you're trying to do. I've been there for 10 years now, and I'm now deputy head. And you come up against a reality which is very different from what you're told it's going to be. I don't regard myself as being a kind of professional pessimist, but I think that one needs to understand the truth. The school is a key element in the series of bodies which ought to be working together: associations, parishes, schools, foundations, all of these bodies which should work together to help people behave in a civilized way. But the state should be part of this, and the state isn't present. It's not simply absent when the police fail to act when there are problems at the school, but the state has also been absent in failing to provide cheap meals or free meals for children whose parents are in need. the school hasn't therefore been able to function as something that's useful for families, that has an impact on people's everyday lives. This is the 2015 Scampia near Naples.
Anche della buona scuola che...
The school, which should, of course, as I say, be a model, something which people can look up to, has been the subject of false descriptions of what it really ought to be trying to do. What we have to try to do is, and you could blame Europe, which might have forced the Italian state to behave in the way that it does, but in Scampia the school is looked upon as something that's distant, not really related to people. It's looked at as an element of possible social change, and therefore in a positive way. But last year we have had a tradition that we pick up children at home so they can attend certain exams. And for some of the children in Scampia, the exam is one which would allow them to graduate from school. And in my official capacity last year, I had to go and talk to the mother of a girl who had to do this third year exam, and I'll tell you this in Neapolitan dialect, because this reflects the everyday life of this kind of situation, and it shows how she felt that the school was something that was totally unrelated to their everyday lives and completely useless as far as they were concerned. And the whole idea of education for legality and for channeling of emotions towards justice is just something they consider to be completely foreign to them. In fact, my 7 minutes are up, but she said, "I've got things to do today, headmistress, and I need my daughter because she needs to help me with my shopping and with the other people. She can go and do the exam next week." This means that in a context of crime, it's something which obviously affects the whole of Naples, not simply the area that our school is, but the school has an ambiguous position. It's useful and necessary in a certain way, but it's often looked at as something that's irrelevant. If it's teaching people 19th century novelists or geometry, it's not regarded as being something that's useful. There's lots of things I could say, but if I've managed to achieve something here, I hope I've tried to stress the role that the school should be playing, the way it should be rooted in the area in which it's placed. It should be able to reach out to people. It should connect with people, with the area that it's in, with the whole city, and with Europe, as we've had visits to from MEPs, and we're going to reciprocate. When I told them that I was going to come here, they said, "You should make it clear to them that Europe needs Scampia and Scampia needs Europe."
Adesso tocca...
Franco Iannello is the next speaker. He's promised to make it short, because of course we can then hear a bit more. Thank you very much. Culture against the Camorra. This is an expression of a cooperative member who, in a meeting such as this one, started to saying, "Well, everybody's abandoned me. I'm going to have to leave the goods that were confiscated from the Camorra to the Camorra because I'm on my own. I'm a former official in the EU, and I said, how can this be that Europe can abandon people and not express and show its solidarity to this person fighting against the Camorra every day? And this led to the idea of creating this association. And this then in the university came back to Brussels, and I contacted my old friends and colleagues, and we decided together to create this association. Well, I'm the president, Franco Agnella, the vice president is a Belgian, and the general secretary is a Frenchman. This meeting the needs that we've heard expressed by almost all of the speakers so far to make it clear to everybody. And I'm not going to talk just about the mafia or the Camorra. I'm talking about organized crime. It is very important to get your terms right, because if you say mafia, it's Italian. Organized crime is spread out throughout Europe, as a study showed recently, done by the Commission, by DG Home Affairs, showing how nowadays organized crime is present in all EU countries. What is it that we want to do? What we want to do is to show and express our solidarity and to push the institutions to do the same, not just talk about the problem, but to not just talk about the facts. The institutions need to stand up and be seen with the citizens, such as the citizens in Scampia, to make it understood that organized crime is extremely dangerous. It starts with crimes that start small, but then they enter the major economy, and then they enter the political world, first through loans, and then you've seen spreading their tentacles. You have mafia presence that have been arrested recently. To make it understood to each Italian citizen that organized crime is dangerous for democracy in Europe. What have we done? We've had a number of conferences on the Camorra in Gothenburg, in Sweden. We organized special schools against the drugs in Naples. We've had a number of activities in Naples in the 2 years that we've existed. We were born on the 8th of November of 2013. So we're a much younger organization than yours. But now we're working on a very important commitment, the European Week of Fight Against Organized Crime, starting on the 16th. In the Italian Cultural Institute with a Bulgarian company. Now, in the Italian Cultural, why are we showing a Bulgarian film in the Cultural Institute? But we wanted to make it understood that organized crime isn't just an Italian phenomenon. It's in Bulgaria, Romania, everywhere. And we convinced them. There will be the showing of this Bulgarian film. There will be 4 or 5 different conferences in the Economic and Social Committee, with the Parliament Intergroup, in the Commission, and in the European Parliament. Through these events, through these conferences, there are 2 objectives we want to achieve. First of all, to bring together all different people who are fighting against organized crime, because Curzio, I'd really like to thank you for inviting me. Believe me, it is very important that I was here, but the other institutions are not here today. We need to reach out to everybody who is fighting organized crime. Otherwise, we're all ineffective because we're compartmentalized in splendid isolation, and we need an organic strategy working together. Organized crime, well, they're organized and we're disorganized. We need to be as organized as they are. And we need to avoid these conferences just being, well, events forgotten about, and you come, make your speech, and go home. No, but after, you need to reach out afterwards. You need Risoli from France, who is a specialist, and in Italy. We need to branch out and to hear the first real cases, and then export these cases and explain, well, what do we aim to do? To me, this is a new way of tackling conferences, because otherwise we're not going to make the connection. We're not going to be able to reach out effectively to the politicians, and when dealing with other institutions as well. This is the way that we're trying to work. We've had a lot of people joining us, many individuals have signed up as members. We would also like to see results. One first result, I hope that working with you will be able to work with Liber, for example, would be to have a sales shop here in Brussels of products working with companies that are working on seized property from organized crime. Here in Brussels, the capital of the European institutions, we could have a symbolic shop selling the products, the produce from these businesses. Curzio, well, one thing that saddens me is that nobody within the institutions working in the cultural world is present at this seminar. Even in the Cultural Affairs Committee, I think they were invited 4 or 5 times, nor from the Commission with the DG for Cultural Affairs. We hope that in the future that we can get responses from the cultural world because, well, it's been said several times in this panel, the problem is not just a police problem, an enforcement problem. It is of increasing this culture of legal life, democratic forces. All too often in Italy, there is this culture of living underground, which is quite widespread, this underground mentality, and that's what we have to fight against. And we also need to ensure that this is seen as a priority in community financing, in particular when it comes to any organization that is fighting organized crime. It isn't fair. Those who are fighting against organized crime, whether it's Libera or Dom Pepper organization or local group in Italy, these structures have to fight for money from other people who are providing consultancies for international companies presenting their projects, fighting for finance with them, and not those who are fighting against organized crime. We would like to come forward with a number of proposals at this conference and hope that we will be heard by politicians and that we can ensure that in this association, our services that we make available to everybody, we don't want to compete with anybody else. I've said it often enough. We have to all work together, joining hands. I think even with the smallest, we're prepared to work together with everybody in everybody's interest. All of those who decisively and resolutely want to fight organized crime and protect democracy. That's the most serious struggle there possibly could be. Thank you. Well, yes, it was quite good that Mr. Ionello recalled that it would be good to have other European institutions participating. Some steps have been taken for this initiative. I've seen that there are non-Italians in the room wearing headphones, so we hope that something will be happening along the lines of what you just hoped. We have 10 minutes left. Are there any questions? Anybody have a question they want to ask? Because I'd have a question, in other words. Two things came to the forefront that really struck me. Here, well, in this panel more than the previous one, for reasons particular to this panel, but I think we realize that the problem is always being seen as somebody else's problem. Even in Italy, journalists, they're constantly shifting the buck to other people. The school in Scampia talks about the students, and they come talk to the MPs, and then the meeting, they need to go to the school. These are the connections that we need to start talking about, that we can start seeing. Libera coming to Brussels, and we have the Italian Cultural Institute in Luxembourg. In Europe, we've often been criticized, but things are moving. Things have been done. For example, with this Bulgarian initiative, funds have been released. We are slowly but surely starting to see things move. The Italian contribution, unfortunately, has been significant in that we're the ones who have had the worst experience in Europe. Another point that I wanted to spend a minute and a half time on, since we're talking about civil society and how we can hit organized crime and how organized crime affects civil society, the role that everybody referred to, the newspapers, the press, aside from the higher level of politics or major events that occur regularly. Perhaps I could ask Anna, don't you think that journalists, the ones who actually should spread the word, they should tell people what's happening in Rome, in Milan, and what battles are being waged in Scampia? Don't you think that there's a problem of censorship of sorts, or what is it exactly?
Guarda, io posso dirti le
I always try to base my arguments on my own experience, so if I'm a pessimist, then I'm a pessimist. But with my students, with colleagues, we've actually had a change in the president of our school board. But I've always tried to tell them that I'm going to talk about what's happened. We're going to go to the European Parliament with 20 kids. We want the MEPs to meet us. We want to look at a committee, talk to them about what local institutions are doing. And it was during last year's local election campaign, and they said, Anna, this is a really good idea, but you can't do it now because we're all focusing on local politics which will make headlines, and it didn't impact on local journalists because Europe wasn't regarded as being newsworthy. If something bad had happened, that two kids were in a knife fight outside the school, of course that would have made headlines. Well, bad news is the only kind of news which the newspapers are interested in. I had some very charming news, some exciting, interesting news, where the dreams of teenagers living in a difficult life, in a difficult place to live, had a chance to go to Brussels and talk to MEPs, and that wasn't of interest to the press. Because there was a chance to make certain that their trips to Brussels would be paid for, because their families, of course, weren't well off. So you've got this occasional piece of good news which does have an impact on local territory, but people aren't interested in hearing it. Well, I can confirm what Anna's just said. Good news is no news. If you see a vineyard that's been burnt down, or land, the forest fire, if you hear about 15,000 kids who volunteered to work on land that's confiscated from the mafia, people aren't interested in that at all. In Italy, you have a choice between writing about restaurants or weapons or a book about the Knights Templar, and there's very little or virtually nothing else to write about. Certainly not organised crime or corruption. It's clear, as I said, that this stuff isn't of interest to people running newspapers or running TV stations, but perhaps we should. That's why people want to talk about things that are going well, not in the mindlessly optimistic way, but there are some things that are going well in Italy. If a journalist wants to talk about, the Knights Templar or the weapons, then it's obviously difficult to get them to talk about corruption.
Molto brevemente posso...
Well, very briefly, I was very surprised that Italian TV wasn't interested in looking at the European Week Against Organised Crime. I wasn't approached. No one was approached by journalists or TV people. I don't know whether people in Brussels didn't do their job, but I'm saying it after the Week Against Organised Crime is already over. I'm a journalist, and I'm obviously in the dock here, and we do have some responsibility for this, because we all know about Scampier, because we've heard about it, we've heard about all the bad things, as Anna said, we've heard about the knife fights, and not about the kind of parliament that the children want to make among themselves. Would anyone like to say anything in the final 4 minutes of the meeting? I'll turn to Lorenzo and say this idea of getting in touch with Brussels, of reaching out to the institutions, has anything come of that? Well, the directive in 2014, which has to be implemented and has been dealt with, the crimes of working with a mafia-type organisation is difficult for common law countries to go along with. But looking at links to organised crime and the various ways that organised crime has linked up with politics through corrupt means is something which needs to be worked on. We've now got commitments on whistleblowing and money laundering, the huge profits that organised crime makes from drugs. Where's that money being invested? It's not just in northern Italy, it's all over Europe. So follow the money, as someone said before. If you do that, you can work out precisely how much money has been spread around a huge number of European countries. Spain, France, Germany, England. Comments off mic. Yes, that's absolutely right. I'm from a region where the prefect said that there was no such thing as the mafia. And then an anti-mafia operation was carried out under his very nose. So it's clear that he didn't really know what he was talking about. But these things need to be talked about. They need to be explained to people. We need to tell people that it is a phenomenon which is, although it was born in Italy, has expanded to not just south of Europe, but to northern Europe too. Not because aliens came and invaded a healthy body, but because that's how things work. It's a bit like the mafia moving into northern Italy. It's the same thing now, but in Europe. They didn't move into northern Europe, northern Italy, because people moved from the south to the north. It's because there were people in the north who allowed them to start off small-scale crimes like kidnapping. That led to drug trafficking with the same people. All the other crimes which spread into Liguria from places like Emilia-Romagna. People have been found guilty of mafia association who aren't from Sicily and aren't from Calabria, but are from Milan and from the places around there. Okay, well, this has been very useful and interesting indeed. It shows that if people taking organised crime like us have to get organised ourselves. I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to thank Curzio Maltese and his staff who've organised this splendid meeting, and I'm sure that we'll see each other again soon. And next Monday, the 16th of November, the 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th, that's the European Week of the Battle Against Organised Crime. There is a programme outside. You won't see many Italians there, because we don't want the whole initiative to be taken over by Italians. We are going to wind this up with a party where the goods or the financing will be provided thanks to confiscated money and goods from criminal organisations. So I hope that we won't just battle organised crime in a determined way, but in a joyous way as well, and that's what the party is all about.
Grazie.